Denver Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain's star continues to rise as he shines in day 2 of Broncos camp. This is your complete camp recap. You get that on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every single day. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day on your favorite audio podcasting platforms, not to mention watching us here on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you have yet to do so already, so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage every single day, all year long. We have you covered from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst, Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, day 2 of Broncos camp is in the books. And I tell you what, there's a lot of takeaways, right? There's a lot of things you're seeing out there. Courtland Sutton looking great as a route runner, the offense getting things going. No pads on yet for either side of the ball. But one thing is for certain, Patrick Surtain. He's an absolute star, man. Just watching him, his level of play the first couple of days of practice have been impeccable technique-wise, and just even in reps against Courtland Sutton, Jeudy, Tim Patrick. He is the real deal, and I tell you what, he just looks even better every single time he steps on the football field.
It's superstar Surtain season, right? That's the way it looks right now. And the quick glimpses the Broncos are giving fans, for those of us that are remote, and the updates that you guys are giving live on the scene. It's been great to read, to follow along, to see and to hear, and to just feel that buzz from afar, right? I mean, Patrick Surtain, obviously high expectations going into year 2. We've even talked about on this show, hey, could he overtake Justin Simmons as maybe the best non-quarterback on the roster? I think, like we've talked about when we discussed that topic, Justin Simmons will have something to say about that. And even so far in camp, we can see that. But man, you love to see Patrick Surtain taking that next step, right? I mean, he obviously was known coming out of Alabama for size, technique, polish, all of these different things, basically being so good that he's boring out there. But he's really been anything but boring since he got to the Denver Broncos, dating back to the pick 6 in one of the first preseason games last year, or maybe it was the first preseason game. And even until now, where we're seeing highlights of him going up and taking away an opportunity for Courtland Sutton to moss, and get that training camp highlight, just taking it right out of his hands. I mean, he's just nasty out there. And we talked before the show. I mean, Ja'Marr Chase, 1,800 yards as a rookie, 1,800 plus actually, and Patrick Surtain held him to 3. I just think it's crazy, man, that this guy, if anything, he's underrated. Even as much hype as he's gotten, if anything, I think still underrated.
Unbelievably underrated. And the play you're referencing, the final play of practice on day 2 at Broncos camp at the UC Health Training Center, Russell Wilson with a perfectly floated ball on a fade route. Courtland goes up, rises up for it. And if you pause it at the right time, the Broncos actually shared this clip on their social feed. If you pause it, Surtain is bodying with his back and his shoulder against Sutton, who's up in the air. Sutton comes down with it, and then Surtain knocks it out of his hands. Like, the way he played that was so beautiful. But here's also something I want to highlight too. Like, Courtland Sutton looks really good, Sayre. Like, he looks like he's back to his old stuff, but even better, like watching him run routes, his route running seems more polished now than it ever has been in his career. He throttles down really quickly. Doesn't give any indication to a DB what he's going to do. So it's very hard to read. But man, I tell you what, watching he and Patrick Surtain battle is great. I had a chance to catch up with Broncos safety Justin Simmons after practice. He and I were chatting. And I just asked him, I said, hey, you guys are going to be playing a lot of these talented wide receivers like the DK Metcalf's week 1, DeAndre Hopkins, the AFC West. And he said, going against guys like Courtland Sutton, Jeudy, Tim Patrick, it's making us better. It's going to make us more ready for the task. And certainly so for a guy like Patrick Surtain going up against a guy like Courtland. We're going to see Surtain follow DK Metcalf around, I imagine, week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks. I'm stoked about it. But, Sayre, there's even something else that you wanted to reference too. When you look at both of these guys, Surtain and Simmons, they really stand out, like in a big-time way for this Broncos secondary so far through the first 2 days of practice. Granted, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but, man, it's just hard to ignore how good they look. Could we see the best absolute versions of these two players this upcoming season?
Well, I love the fact that after practice, Nathaniel Hackett talked about the fact that he was asked a question like, why are you going ones on ones? And he said, best on best. I mean, that's exactly what you want to see. You want to see your best, bring out the best in your best on the other side of the field. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. We know that Justin Simmons, he's made plays at practice and training camp his whole career, and he translated that to the games. And Patrick Surtain as well, even last year as a rookie at his rookie training camp, making plays, doing things. But it's different with Russell Wilson at the quarterback position because, like you mentioned, with a play that Russell Wilson placed the ball perfectly to Jeudy, kind of on a deep post. I mean, you can describe that play in detail, but I mean, from the sounds of it, Justin Simmons is making it hard even for a guy like Russell Wilson and Jeudy, who's great at getting separation, who's great at getting open. Even when you do things perfectly as an offense, these two guys are coming in and ruining it. And so it's making the offense better. It's like, okay, we got to figure out that competitive edge, that competitive advantage, because these guys aren't giving us an inch.
They seriously aren't. And that play that you're referencing, it was a deep post pattern from Jeudy inside the slot, and it was going across the field. Now, Justin Simmons was playing underneath, kind of the robber. Kareem Jackson was playing the middle part of the field. And really, this looks a lot like it is Vic Fangio's defense, but a Giro Evro's terminology. And the way that these guys have just kind of clicked and have been getting through things, they look really good. But Russ threw the ball perfectly over the top for Jerry. You had Kareem over the top, who was literally right in front of Jeudy, and you had Justin Simmons, who was robbing the underneath. He comes out of nowhere, knocks the pass away. Like, if none of those guys are there, if there's like maybe even like 2 yards of separation, or even a yard of separation on any part of them from Jeudy to Justin to Kareem, that's a completed catch. That might even be a touchdown. It was such a fantastic play defensively. Maybe they'll show it on the highlights, because I know they show that every single day, 3:30 p.m. Mountain Time on the Broncos YouTube channel. Hopefully they show that, because that was a fantastic play. But you know what? The Broncos defense continued to ramp things up. But there's also an offensive player who continues to ball after 2 days of Broncos camp. Does Russell Wilson have a new tight end one? We talk about Eric Saubert and his impressive couple days here coming up here in just a moment on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But before we do that, let me tell you about our good friends over there at betonline.net. Betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. You can find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. And BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. So head to betonline.net here today, or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the actions. BetOnline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. Could Eric Saubert emerge as the tight end one for this Denver Broncos team after 2 impressive days at Broncos camp? Thank you so much once again, Broncos country, for tuning into Locked On Broncos, making us your first listen of the day. We have you covered every single day for all the training camp news and recap. I'm there in person every day at every practice. I'll be at every game this season, and you can get in-depth coverage broken down objectively from Sayre, Bedinger, and myself here, Locked On Broncos. Sayre, Eric Saubert, man, I tell you what, Sobby, the nickname that Russell Wilson has given him, and that's also his Instagram handle. He is really turning heads so far through the first couple of days of training camp, and he's really taking advantage of the opportunity, because once again on day 2, Greg Dulcich working off to the side as he continues to recover from a hamstring injury that he sustained during mandatory minicamp. The Broncos just being very cautious with him. Now, once they transition to the team side of things, Dulcich had a kind of a play script in hand, and he was there. He was attentive. He was in the huddle, but obviously not being able to carry things out physically just yet. We'll see if he makes his way onto the practice field beginning next week. But Eric Saubert, man, I tell you what, Sayre, he's been super impressive, not only just from what we've seen do. Like day 1, he caught 2 touchdown passes from Russell Wilson and caught 1 really good ball across the middle of the field. On day 2, though, we saw him once again come up reliable when the Broncos defense was bringing on some pressure, but he also set things up as a run blocker. I mean, they used him to come wide and to seal a guy at the next level. It was a play side inside linebacker. He's looking good as a blocker too. So he's kind of becoming an all-around threat here for the Broncos and for Russell Wilson. And this chemistry and the real estate that they've built together, tell you what, Eric Saubert, could he be tight end one, Sayre?
I think what you just said is maybe the most important factor in this, the chemistry that he's developing with Russell Wilson. That's absolutely huge. Of course, early on in training camp and really throughout training camp, you love to follow the storylines and the threads and the hype that's being built around certain players. Like if a lot of media people and a lot of fans are talking about certain players in attendance, and they're seeing it firsthand, if a player is standing out that much to catch the eyes of the masses, that really says a lot. But here's what I'm thinking as well. Eric Saubert is stealing headlines from Albert Okwuegbunam, and Greg Dulcich isn't out there on the field. We haven't heard anything about Eric Tomlinson or the other backup tight end options that the Denver Broncos have, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything at this point. The coaches may be seeing things that they want to see and that they like to see. But at the same time, I think Eric Saubert is taking advantage of a massive opportunity. This is his 5th NFL season. He came into the league back in 2017 as a 5th-round draft pick, and we talked about him on yesterday's show as well. But we may continue talking about him because if he continues to stand out, he is basically on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know, other than offensive line, there really isn't a position that's kind of up for grabs. And this offseason, I think when Noah Fant was traded in the Russell Wilson deal, that tight end 1 position became wide open for anybody to take. And initially, everybody thought it's Albert O. Then Greg Dulcich comes in, and the runaway freight train of his OTAs gets halted only by an injury, which puts him out for now. But I mean, Eric Saubert has taken full advantage, and it's great to see because that's exactly what training camp is all about, right? That's what the preseason is all about. You may only get one opportunity, but if you get that opportunity, you got to go take advantage. You got to take advantage of those targets in the red zone, score those touchdowns, catch those balls in the seam over the middle that you're getting those every opportunity. And Eric Saubert is out there taking advantage, and he's maybe, I mean, can we say it's not even a hot take at this point? He might be
No.
tight end 1.
Yeah, he very well might be too. But I will pinpoint too about Albert Okwuegbunam was involved on day 2 of Broncos camp in the passing game. I think they utilized him on a tight end screen. So I like to be able to see that, but they also used him on some underneath stuff. I personally believe like it doesn't matter. I think if Eric Saubert is tight end 1, Greg Dulcich is 2, Albert O is 3, or vice versa, however the order may go. One thing I really believe is that they're going to use a lot because, Sayre, we saw a lot of heavy 13 personnel here for the Broncos through the first couple of days of training camp practice at the UC Health Training Center. So I imagine a lot of those guys, kind of how we view the running back role with Melvin and Javonte. I think tight end is a little different. You can split reps up amongst those guys because the workload for them is really not going to be as much as heavy as it would be if you're playing the running back position. Those are some things that stood out to me. Eric Tomlinson was mainly used in some plays as well, made some reps today, and was on the outside at kind of playing like the extra tackle help when the Broncos went with heavy protection and some play action stuff there. So he was mainly a pass blocking guy, didn't really release for any routes. They used Andrew Beck still, and they worked in some guys like Dylan Parham from time to time. But I think the Broncos' main tight ends are really there. You have Eric Saubert, you're going to have Dulcich when he comes back and is healthy, and Albert O. And I think the Broncos are going to be in good hands because those guys can move really, really well. And they did just that. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're going to get some other observations from camp. The edge rushers standing out once again in a big way through 2 days of practice at the UC Health Training Center, not to mention some other impressions and observations, including Montreal, Washington, and more. You get that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me just remind you, if you're a brand new listener or viewer of the Locked On Broncos podcast, Sayre Bedinger and myself, we have you covered every single day, all year long, with all the Denver Broncos news, content, coverage you need, short, bite-sized, to the point, with an objective point of view. I'll be on the road covering the Broncos on their road games. I'll be at every home game. I'll be at every practice. So make sure you tune your dials here to Locked On Broncos so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage without the hot take baloney. You get all that here, the Locked On Broncos podcast. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos continue with our final closing thoughts on day 2 of Broncos camp at the UCL Training Center. Thank you once again, Broncos country, for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. Make sure you comment on the YouTube section down below. We love interacting with every member in Broncos country. Now, Sayre, one thing that's really stood out to me in training camp, now granted, as we've talked about, the pads are not yet on. The pads will come on next week for the Broncos, and I think we'll be able to evaluate maybe some of the trench warfare a little bit more clearly. But until that happens, a lot of it's just speculation. But one thing that is concrete, it is factual. The Broncos edge rushers look pretty good, whether it be Aaron Patrick, Nick Bonito, Baron Browning, Bradley Chubb, and Malik Reed. All those guys had a really good day on day 2 of Broncos camp. And I want to continue to reference when it's the first team O versus the first team defense, Malik Reed and Bradley Chubb, and even the interior, Draymond Jones is standing out in a big-time way for the Broncos, creating pressure from that interior, sliding inside, and forcing Russell Wilson to have to maneuver outside the pocket. And then you have your pass rushers coming off the edge. it made things a little difficult for us on a few plays with Malik and Bradley forcing him to throw the ball away a couple times for a few incompletions. I'm loving what we're seeing so far from the edge rushers.
You want to have depth off the edge. There's no question about it. And I think the
Ton of it.
Broncos have it in spades, which is great. That was not the case last year as they're trading for Stephen Weatherly and making all these other different types of moves throughout the year, especially after the Von Miller trade, right? So I think definitely you want to go into the season having more than you need, which is a great problem to have because I think from my vantage point, and I kind of went on a little bit of a Twitter rant about this, just the idea that the Broncos could be transitioning away from, and this isn't concrete or anything. Nobody has reported this, but transitioning away from the off-ball linebacker. Remember a couple years ago, they carried 6 or maybe even 7 onto that active roster. And I think those days are long gone. I think that more likely you're going to see 6 up to 6 potentially and maybe more edge guys just because of their ability to play special teams and their ability to impact the game in such a substantial way, and the Broncos, we know they're going to be playing a lot of nickel. They're going to be playing a lot of dime, and just the way that you can manipulate the roster anymore with 16 practice squad spots, weekly call-ups, you could definitely add another linebacker or 2 or 3 to your practice squad and call those guys up on game days for needed depth. But man, how are you going to cut anyone off the edge, especially when somebody like Aaron Patrick, who's 6'5", 250 pounds, runs a
He's
4.53.
fast.
I mean, he's got 35-inch arms, 39-inch vertical leap. He's a freakish athlete out there, and he's standing out without the pads on, which to me only indicates that once the pads come on, he's going to be able to be even more physical. And so to me, I just don't know. 1 through 6, you look at this list, even with Randy Gregory on the mend, even with Christopher Allen on the mend, even considering that Baron Browning at worst case scenario could go back and play off ball linebacker. I just really feel like you have such depth there off the edge that, man, it's bordering on embarrassment of riches. I know it's been a question mark for a lot of people, and rightfully so. I mean, we need to see these guys do some things on the field in actual gameplay. But I think from just a projection standpoint, from a roster building standpoint, the Broncos are sitting in a very good spot right now.
They really are. And we talk about the depth at edge rusher. I was talking with Andrew Mason. I was talking with Eric DeLala, and we were just talking about the amount of guys that they have that can really play. And it's like, what did they do last year? I mean, they had Andre Mintz last season, who's now a member of the Minnesota Vikings, Aaron Patrick alongside Malik Reed, Jonathan Cooper, Bradley Chubb, Von Miller. Like, they still had a loaded room last year, but now you flex in the versatility of those guys like Browning and Benito and what they're able to do. Patrick being maybe a core special teams guy that the coaching staff really, really likes. But then you also look at the offensive line. It's just the amount of depth that they have there. Now, Sayre, there was a little bit of a change up in the first team Broncos offensive line here on day 2 of Broncos camp. There was Dalton Reisner at left guard, Garrett Bowles at left tackle. You had Lloyd Cushenberry at center, but you had Netani Muti getting a majority of the first team reps at right guard here today for the Broncos, whereas Quinn Miners on day 1 got a majority of the reps at the right guard spot. And then Calvin once again getting every single right tackle rep possible, which, like I said, I think it benefits Calvin the more that he's on the field than Billy Turner's not. He's going to be that right tackle. And there's some other contingency plans, like with Dalton Reisner. If the Broncos want to look to offset him, Netani Muti could play there, or they could even slide Billy Turner over to left guard. That's something that's been alluded to. But even some other interesting notes on the second team offense. Graham Glasgow moved to center and got all of the second team reps with the second team offense. And I think that's where the Broncos are kind of picturing him. Now, I think a storyline I'm going to follow on day 3 and even on Saturday's practice back to football. Will he get any reps at all with the first team this week? That's something I'm really looking forward to seeing here with this new coaching staff. But the offensive line has some unique rotations going on right now.
Well, what you just said fascinates me because if Netani Muti is getting reps with the first team offense at right guard and Quinn Miners is getting reps at, right guard with the first team offense as well, I mean, that was Graham Glasgow's job last year. That was his job before the crazy injury that he suffered in that Cowboys game. Really, that didn't need to happen at all. So that's pretty wild to me. First and foremost, I mean, awesome that Graham Glasgow's not even on the pup. He's out there practicing.
Yeah.
He's healthy enough to be out there. That's fantastic news. So I love hearing that, but that's really interesting. You kind of caught me off guard with that because you would think, I mean, that was his starting job last year, right? So if anyone was going to slide in for a competition behind Quinn Miners, the guy that was the incumbent, right? But I mean, very, very interesting development, especially with Glasgow playing center. I know when we watched him, some of his tape from the Detroit Lions after he signed with the Denver Broncos, he played really well at the center position. So maybe some actual competition for Cushionberry. I don't know. But I mean, that would be fascinating to see as well. Really good stuff on the offensive line, and good eyes out there getting to see that, because man, those are big developments. And we know Nathaniel Hackett talked about after the practice. And this was something that I hadn't really considered, because to me, and what we've talked about on this show, is really wanting to see that starting five offensive line kind of come to that cream rise to the top as quickly as possible. But that's not necessarily Nathaniel Hackett's philosophy. He talked after the practice about really wanting to be able to see these different offensive line combinations together, because throughout the course of the season, I mean, you got to kind of expect that that's going to happen, that you're going to need to
Yeah.
see Muti at right guard, that you're going to need to see Miners and this, that, and the other. So I kind of liked that. I kind of changed my stance a little bit on saying, hey, get that starting five solidified quickly and just go. No, you want to get some chemistry between all of these different guys playing, because they may be playing together at any given time.
Well, and that's a great point as well. I think for the coaching staff, as you mentioned, you're working with all these guys, you're seeing who kind of excels and who stands out the most. Once you get your starting lineup solidified, you now have the option, okay, hey, we have really good depth. Like if this guy goes down, we know this guy will step up and will not miss a beat in that role, which I don't feel like the Broncos had that last year. I feel completely opposite now going into this season than I did last year. And I also want to say too, I just feel like last year, like looking at this roster now, Sarah, I feel like this Broncos roster is 10 times better than last year's Broncos roster that they had, which they still have some pretty dang good players last year. But this one, it just seems like there is so much depth. There's so much competition. There's so many good players that are pushing for a spot. Man, it's going to be a hard decision for the personnel department to have to come in and say, hey, we're going to cut these guys. We're going to hope to bring them back on practice squad and hope that some other NFL team doesn't come out of nowhere and swoop them up off of waivers. But you know what? There's a long time before that happens. The Broncos will host the Cowboys August 13th at Empower Field at Mile High for the first preseason game. And then after that, roster cuts will go from 90 to 85. We'll have complete coverage all throughout Broncos training camp and preseason and the regular season here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in here once again. You can get us on your favorite podcast provider, or you can get us here on YouTube. Make sure you do us a favor. If you haven't hit that subscribe or that follow button already, make sure you do so you never miss out on all the Denver Broncos news, content, coverage that you need all in one place. Locked On Broncos.